maybe court-oriented to the court. So what next? What next after court judgment? Let me start by sharing a story with you. It's the story of Jack. Jack sold a car to Jane, and it turned out that she got the car, but she refused to make payment for the car. Now, having made several attempts to get Jane to pay for the car, he decided to go to the court to get the court to intervene and compel Jane to pay him for the transaction. Now, eventually, Jack has gone through the hurdles of proving his case, and the court eventually gave a judgment by which Jack is entitled to get his money from Jane. Unfortunately, now Jack has this judgment and is quite concerned about what next after court judgment, and that's why we're having this conversation. So I'm going to share some random thoughts with you, just give you hints on the different things about judgment and enforcement. Random thoughts, we said. So let's start with random thought number 1. A judgment can only be enforced against the person against whom the judgment was given, or against whom the judgment is made. Now, what that would mean, so we use the example, come back to the example of Jack and Jane. Now, Jack cannot decide to say because Mr. Joe, who is Jane's husband, is a wealthy, well-to-do guy, and then he decides to go enforce the judgment against Mr. Joe. Let's also say that he decides to attach something to get his judgment. He cannot go pick another person's property and attach it as a means of getting enforcing his judgment. So that's number 1 point, which you should be able to, you have to master that, right? Judgment can only be enforced against the person against whom that judgment was made. Now, random thought number 2. In enforcing a court judgment, efforts must be made. So you have to make efforts to keep strictly to the terms of that judgment which you are seeking to enforce. In essence, if the court has ordered Jane to pay certain amounts, now Jack cannot decide to unilaterally, right, begin to add 1 or 2 things and say cost of logistics, this and that, and begin to add all of them. Now it becomes the judge by so doing. So you must put in every effort to ensure that you are keeping strictly to the terms of the judgment that you are seeking to enforce. That's number 2. And I hope you're having fun on that. Please remember, get to the comment box, ask your questions. Let's make this interactive. Ask your questions. Also, so these are just random thoughts. You may also have some contributions, and we're all learning together. So feel free, let's get to this. And remember, share with your colleagues. If you're joining this conversation, please, we are begging of you, share with people. Now, this is not going to cost you really anything, but it would help you to be able to get people to also learn knowledge. So please, we beg of you, keep sharing as much as you can. Share across different social media platforms. This is the way that we can all help people to be knowledgeable as well about this kind of information. You never can tell who needs. So please share what we are discussing. Let people engage as well. Okay, so random point 3. Once a judgment is gotten from a court, that judgment is enforceable, and it is enforceable except the only way that it will not be enforceable is where the person against whom the judgment was made decides to appeal the judgment. And I'm going to explain, just get into it, what it means to say you're appealing a judgment. So I have it here. Once a judgment is gotten from a court, that judgment is enforceable against the person affected by the judgment, and except that person decides to appeal to a higher court to annul the judgment, that judgment stands valid and effective. for all purposes, which is going to be my point 4. But let's quickly dwell on this and let's see what it means. Now, by implication, it will mean that if Jane, for instance, is dissatisfied with the court's judgment, she can choose to appeal, and then giving tangible reasons why she believes that the judgment should be set aside. But as far as there is no appeal, valid appeal, let me use that word, that judgment is presupposed, is assumed to be valid, and it is an existing judgment that should be respected until there is something that is setting it aside, or there is something contrary, or otherwise there is an established effort made by the person against whom the judgment was made, in the course of, say, the person is now appealing and challenging that judgment, that look, I am not satisfied with this judgment and I want a higher court to hear my position and set it aside. Until you do that, that judgment remains valid. And that takes me, just sequentially, a flow. It takes me to the next point, which is the fact that a judgment is valid whether or not it was validly procured. I don't want to be using plenty braggados and all of those grammar here. The point simply is that, look, if a judgment is given, whether or not it was validly given, it's a different thing entirely. The fact that that judgment was given is sufficient to mandate that those affected by the judgment must obey that judgment, which is why there is always room for appeal. So I have it stated that judgment is valid whether it was validly procured or otherwise. So it should be obeyed, not just honored. When you say something should be honored, it means that you can subject it to your own personal will, but it must be obeyed. That's the point, really. It must be obeyed, even if it appears to be wrong, even if it's unreasonable, even if it appears, look, this thing is just not reasonable. It must be enforced, it must be obeyed to the letter. It must be obeyed to the letter. And that's really the point that we're trying to make here. And, sometimes there are situations, one of those things which we said earlier on is, just in case you're not satisfied with a court judgment, you can decide to appeal. But again, there are situations where you're not satisfied with a court judgment and you have basis to say this judgment or this order of the court must be set aside. And there are situations where you don't have to go on appeal. You can go back to the same court and engage the judge. I do not mean engage in your private conversation, no. By way of an application, by way of a request, urging the court, urging the judge to set that order aside. And there are instances where this is possible. So, for instance, if the judgment or the order was gotten by way of fraud. So let me find a random example. Let's say that that certain information were put together to get the judgment, and those information happen to be untrue, right? Now that could be a basis for saying, look, this judgment was fraudulently procured from the court. And sometimes it may not just be that kind of instance. It could be by reason of a mistake. Let's say that so a mistake in law is different from what regular people refer to as mistake. Because of our time, we'll not get into that. But you can get my book, Think Like a Lawyer, where I dissected the principle of mistake and what it means in law as different from the regular, I made a mistake, which people say in the regular regular use of the word mistake. So get my book, Think Like a Lawyer. That is going to guide you on that subject. But let's come back again to what we are discussing. So the mistake in law, it could be a basis as well for telling a court that, look, you need to set aside this judgment. And then sometimes if there were misrepresentations as well, so misrepresentation in what was put before the court, and another basis could be in case of incompetence. Or for instance, so let's find a random example here. Let's assume that Jack was making a claim for 20 million naira, whereas the court that Jack approached only had the power to exercise on subjects that are not more than, let's say, 10 million. Now Jack has made a claim for 20 million, and the court maybe did not put its mind to the fact that this claim is way more than the capacity of what I can handle under the law. So where this is brought to the attention of the court or of the judge has a right to set himself or herself aside, or to set the other aside. So these are very interesting situations that relates to instances where the court or the judge, pardon me, I keep using court and judge, where now we're relating with you as a non-lawyer, hopefully, but if a lawyer is hearing this, the lawyer understands that court is synonymous with judge. But now, I hope you also are able to relate with that. So when you hear court sometimes, of course, we are talking about the judge, okay? So that could also, happen. And then fifth random thought to be shared today is that never use self-help. Do not use self-help to enforce a court judgment. In the first place, it is not your judgment. It is the judgment of a court. And the courts and the officers of the court are the right people to enforce a court judgment. Let me repeat that again. And I want you to type it in the comment box if you're following this conversation. Never use self-help to enforce a court judgment. So Jack cannot say, for instance, that look, now I have a court judgment saying that you have to pay me my money, and then he goes by himself all the way to go lock Jane's store, saying that until that money is paid, since he has a court order, that's going to amount to self-help, and that can land Jack in trouble. So do not use self-help, right, to enforce a court judgment. It is the judgment of a court, and there are laws, there are provisions, there are rules that guide the enforcement of a court judgment. And these rules are scattered across. You would have some of them in the 1999 Constitution, which is the ground norm, which is the mother of all laws. And then you have as well in the Sheriff and Civil Process Act, which establishes the office of the sheriff and the bailiff as the appropriate people to enforce a court order. And these are very interesting things that you should be mindful of. And then I will get to my sixth point of the day, where we are going to be closing for today. Calling it a wrap. Now, this is very crucial. There are different forms of judgment. Some judgments could be executory in nature. Some could just be a declaration. What do I mean by this? A judgment that just declares the right of the parties. Okay, this. I am declaring that this. It's merely declarative. And such a judgment, of course, should also be obeyed. But because it's a mere declaration, that it lacks execution. It would lack the capacity to be enforced. But the other kind of judgment, which is executory judgment, is that one that has the action word, right? Declaration is just, well, I am declaring the rights of people. I'm declaring the rights of the parties. Yes, this is right. Yes, this is wrong. I have made that declaration. Now, executory is now, I am now making an order. And now that becomes the force. That becomes the power behind the seat of the judge. Now, when that is the case, that will now mean that you are able to enforce such an order to the letters. And enforcing such an order, bear in mind as well that it depends on the subject matter. So, for instance, if I go to court to to challenge somebody for breach of contract. Now they call it could be something involving liquidated sum, meaning something that we can count and know this is how much, or there is interest, percentage agreed by parties and all of that. There are ways that you can enforce such a judgment. And let's say that you're going to court was to just go challenge that you are the owner of a property. Remember, the first example we used now is case of breach of contract, where it's an amount, it's monetary situation. Now, there is also the situation of what if you go to court, somebody trespassed on your property, and then you went to court to challenge that this property is yours. Now, that's another kind of judgment, right? And then what if what you've gone to challenge is for something to be delivered to you, right? So in a balance, well, let's not even get to administrative law. But what if what you've challenged is specific performance or something, or even delivery of products, delivery of goods? It's not money, but someone has refused to deliver something. So what of that situation? Or what if what you've gone to challenge is actually to get a court order to restrain somebody from doing an act or continuing to do an act? What if? So there are a whole lot of what ifs, and to all of these what ifs, there are different means of enforcing all of these orders. And the interesting thing is, this is what we are going to continue on for the coming weeks. So if you've joined today, we will need you to join over and over so that you can have a robust knowledge of how judgments work. And my colleague is going to be picking on one of them. I don't even want to bite my tongues now, but I'm very sure that she's going to do a fantastic work on it, right? It's called the rate of peripheras, right? I said I don't want to bite my tongue, but I'm just compelled to say something about it. So you're going to find this very interesting next week, and it's just one of those means of enforcing a monetary judgment, and you're going to find it very interesting. We'll talk about garnishing proceedings, among many other means of enforcing court order or court judgment, and you'll find this very interesting. So I want you to stay tuned. Thursday next week, Accent Litigation is going to be having this conversation again, where we will delve deep into this particular idea and how you can use it to, how you can ensure that you are getting the proceeds, the dividends of you going to court to get a court order. And I hope you found today very interesting. My name is Untitled Chapter once again, and I'm privileged to take the lead on this conversation. Remember to tune in again, same time next week. But before next week, yes, we'll come your way again, 2 p.m. tomorrow. And that's how we do it every week. And one more thing. So the anchors right in the studio have asked me to also let you know that there's going to be a training on how you can author your book within 3 months. Fantastic. So that's happening on Saturday by 8 a.m. So you can reach out to get the link to join that session. And I bet with you, it's truly a fantastic, realistic thing that is happening right here at the Accent Radio Studio. Thank you for joining once again. God bless you. Do have a wonderful, fantastic evening. Bye.